I'm Arthur Kent, and welcome back to the History Channel. We're here at the U.S. Army base at Fort Stewart, Georgia, home to one of the most highly skilled and rapidly deployable mechanized forces in the world, the 3rd Infantry Division. In 1991, as a reporter on the front lines of the first Gulf War, I witnessed the liberation of Kuwait accomplished with dizzying speed. But that was just one of America's objectives. The other, the destruction of Saddam Hussein's military machine, was left unfinished. So why did the president call a halt to the ground war after just 100 hours? The answer next, in Operation Desert Storm, the final showdown.
3, 2, 1.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
10 hours after the Marines began their push northward toward Kuwait City on February 24th, 1991, the main attack of the ground war got underway. It was a sweeping armored maneuver known as the left hook that would descend on the Iraqis from behind.
We wanted to attack them and hit them in the flank before they knew the direction and the size of the attack.
Ready to roll whenever. Good. We're running good.
The force that would deliver this blow was the U.S. Army 7th Corps, commanded by General Fred Franks. Their mission was to destroy the heart of Iraq's army, 3 armored divisions of the elite force known as the Republican Guard.
We knew that the Republican Guards, who were well-armed, well-equipped, the best trained of the Iraqi forces, who were really our principal mission and our focus of our attack, that they would fight back, that they would attempt to maneuver, and that they were a much more skillful and motivated force than the frontline Iraqi units.
Those forces, the ones the Marines were attacking, were regular army, mainly conscripts. Poorly trained and poorly equipped. They had also been seriously weakened by Allied bombing attacks. This was not the case with the Republican Guard.
There were 3 heavy divisions, armored mechanized divisions, equipped with the Soviet T-72 tanks, very good tanks, and the BMPs, first line infantry carriers. So it was good equipment. Our intelligence said they were disciplined, they were tough, they would fight to the death.
The Republican Guard had 7 divisions arrayed along the northern border of Kuwait. The Americans had 5 divisions from 7 Corps and 4 from another corps, the 18 Corps, moving toward the Iraqis. But the main battle would be between the strongest forces from both sides. They were the 3 armored divisions in 7 Corps and the 3 armored divisions of the Republican Guard, the Tawalkana, the Medina, and the Hammurabi.
We started out attacking to the north, and then we would have to turn 90 degrees to the east in essentially a left hook. I wanted to do that without stopping and to hit the Republican Guards with a 3 armored division fist, approximately over 1,000 tanks and some 600 infantry fighting vehicles.
Leading 7 Corps' advance through a sandstorm in search of the Republican Guard was a cavalry troop commanded by Captain H.R. McMaster.
We really were going into an uncertain situation, and we were doing our job as cavalry troopers. We were going out, riding out in front of the main formation, much like cavalry has done in centuries past, to find the enemy's defensive positions.
60 hours into the ground war, he suddenly spotted a brigade from the Tawalkana division of the Republican Guard hidden behind a ridge. His tank was already at close range.
So immediately what happened is the entire crew went into action. Sergeant Koch, my gunner, is engaging targets. Our loader is loading the appropriate ammunition, yelling up and arming the gun, while Sergeant Koch lays on the next target and destroys it.
They attacked in a sandstorm, and so a lot of units, maybe that weren't perhaps as well trained as they, weren't as confident as they, might have stopped and just called artillery and waited till the sandstorm stopped. The Iraqis were surprised that they attacked in that bad weather.
What I remember most vividly are the first rounds from our tank. The first round was a heat round, so it made a tremendous explosion as it hit the enemy tank. I remember the tank commander was thrust out of the hatch of the tank, and he himself was on fire. As my tank was moving to engage other enemy tanks, we got 3 rounds off just before our other 8 tanks came up over the ridge and were able to engage the enemy. And what I remember then is the entire enemy defense seemed to explode in a ball of fire.
It all is summed up in my mind by a report that I asked for from all of the senior Iraqis who were captured. When did you first know you were under attack? I mean, this is all the lieutenant colonels and generals. The most common answer that the Iraqis responded, we knew we were under attack when the vehicles around me started to explode.
In just 30 seconds, 8 Iraqi tanks, top-of-the-line Soviet T-72s, were in flames. The Americans' M1A1 tank had the advantage of nearly impenetrable steel-plated armor. Although it weighed 63 tons, the tank could still maneuver in the desert at speeds up to 35 miles an hour. It also came equipped with a 120-millimeter cannon.
The rate of fire of our weapon systems was a tremendous advantage. We could fire about 3 rounds for every 1 round of the Iraqi tanks. The Iraqi tanks relied on automatic loaders, and those automatic loaders were cumbersome. They took a long time to get a second round in. So while we know of 4 Iraqi tanks that fired at us, no Iraqi tanks got a second round off.
In 23 minutes of combat, 30 Iraqi tanks and 16 armored vehicles were destroyed with no American losses. 9 lone tanks had cut a 3-mile-wide swath through Iraq's premier fighting force, a force 4 times the size of the Americans.
It was an enormously successful attack for our Corps. It fixed the Republican Guard's defense. It discovered the southern edge of the Republican Guard's defense. And I believe it was, in a larger sense, it was a vindication of the battle-focused, tough, realistic training the United States Army had been doing for years.
Minutes after McMaster's first encounter, 18 more M1A1 tanks and 24 Bradley fighting vehicles, along with artillery, joined the fray. The light armored Bradleys carried a 25-millimeter cannon, a machine gun, and the TOW anti-tank weapon. The artillery included howitzers and multiple launch rocket systems, which blanketed large areas with thousands of bombers. In the Battle of 73 Easting, as it became known, the overwhelming American firepower routed an entire Republican Guard brigade in just 4 hours. The victory set up the fight 7 Corps had been waiting for.
When we turned our Corps 90 degrees to the east in this rolling attack with a fist, at that point in time, we had essentially 10 brigades, 10 armor brigades on line attacking the Iraqis. That was the biggest battle of the war.
Next, 7 Corps delivers the left hook, a blow even more lethal than expected. By the end of the 3rd day of the ground war, the victory at the Battle of 73 Easting was certain. Now the full strength of 7 Corps was on the move, about to deliver the first massive blow to the central elements of the Republican Guard's Talwalkana Division.
General Franks moved 1st Armored, 3rd Armored, and 1st Infantry all simultaneously together as a fist on the night of the 26th of February. And at 1000 hours in the evening, 2200 military time, the tanks of the 1st Infantry Division and our Bradley fighting vehicles all went hot against Republican Guard forces.
The Battle of 73 Easting had set a precedent for this attack.
It was good for a number of reasons. It instilled a lot of confidence in the American troops, in their equipment, in their wherewithal to destroy the enemy at extended ranges. We have to understand that many of our troops did not understand the lethality of the tanks they were fighting with.
We had given credit to the T-72s and BMPs as being, while not on par with our Abrams tanks and our Bradley fighting systems, at least systems that were somewhat comparable. It turned out they were not even close to comparable.
Among their advantages, the Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles had much better sights. They used an infrared night sight that differentiated between hot and cold objects.
You can see an enemy tank that has retained some residual heat either from its own engine or from the sun hitting it most of the day. And so you can see that as a spot on your sight, and you can put the aiming point on that. And the calculation of the ballistics equation is all done for you, and the proper selection of the ammunition, and you keep the aiming point on the target, you're going to hit it.
The ability to see through the weather, to see through the sandstorms, to see through the fog and smoke, and to see at night gave us a capability that enabled us to continuously surprise the Iraqis at the tactical level.
Once the Americans had an Iraqi tank in their sights, it took only one hit to destroy it.
The most lethal weapon on the battlefield, at least in the direct firefight, was the main gun of the Abrams tank, the 120 gun. The soldiers referred to the service ammunition that we used in battle as the silver bullet. It's a depleted uranium round.
Depleted uranium is a hard material, much like tungsten, and so it provides a very dense, hard material that's easily manufactured and easily machined into this narrow, what we call long rod penetrator.
It's a round that has extraordinary penetration power.
Fundamental thing that you had, because of the density of the warhead, the munition stayed on course and on target, and you could shoot it further and hit where you were aiming.
The accuracy and power of the 120 millimeter shell weren't the only reasons it took just one hit to destroy the T-72. The Soviet tanks also had a fatal design flaw.
The T-72 had the ammunition inside the crew compartment. And so when the spalling would take place, this very hot spalling caused by the penetration of the depleted uranium penetrator, this would cause a heat effect, which would in turn detonate the onboard ammunition. And then within a matter of probably half a second, you would see this explosion occur, horrendous explosion, onboard ammunition. And the turrets of the tank would spiral 30, 40, 50 feet up in the air once the hit took place.
The Abrams tanks were also firing long before the Iraqis had the Americans in their sights. In fact, the Americans discovered, in battle, that they could hit their targets at ranges of almost 2 miles, while the Iraqis had to get within a little more than 1 mile to be effective.
This became a tactic very quickly. Our soldiers learned, don't close with the Iraqis, stay at range. We can hit them at long range and they can't hit us.
They were virtually ineffective in slowing down the totality and momentum of the Army and the momentum of the corps. Find them, destroy them, continue to move. Find them, destroy them, continue to move. So at the end of the day, there were no pitched battles where one might draw comparisons to previous wars.
The Talwalkana Division of the Republican Guard was destroyed overnight. The Medina Division was next. It would be the largest tank battle of the war.
When we came in contact, there was a line of tanks and BMPs and artillery for as far as you could see. So we had fires across the front with tanks and Bradleys and BMPs, and then we had our artillery firing both at the front line positions and firing at their artillery in depth, and then the Apaches attacking even deeper in the zone against their artillery and their formations further in depth of the battlefield. It was a very brutal fight. Fortunately for us, it was very one-sided as well.
5 American battalions routed the Medina Division's 2nd Brigade, as well as part of a brigade from the Adnan Division of the Republican Guard. 300 Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed in what became known as the Battle of Medina Ridge. It was the Iraqis' last attempt to form an organized defense. While Frank's 7th Corps was in the midst of this main attack, reports began coming into Allied headquarters of a large Iraqi convoy far to the east. The convoy was reported to be on the highway leading out of Kuwait City.
Our first concern was, how do we stop the Iraqis from returning this military equipment to Iraq? So we put airplanes that night in across the highway.
Roger, go 35 out of 1,000 for 4,000.
Pilots were ordered to stop the convoy at all costs. If that wasn't motivation enough, the commander sent the pilots into battle with the latest news report.
That a missile had just hit a barracks in Dhahran, and that 60 or so servicemen were killed. And our mission was to go up and stop the retreating forces as they left Kuwait City. And he said, put some hate in your heart, and he'll be waiting here when we get back. When we took off, we had expected to see convoys leaving Kuwait City, but we weren't prepared for the magnitude, the number of vehicles that were on the ground that we saw when we broke out under the clouds.
The air attack was relentless. Bombs were dropped on the front and rear of the procession, trapping the rest of the vehicles in between.
The headlights all went out, but because of the reflections of the oil fires and the twilight cast by the low clouds, I was able to still see all the vehicles on the road. Could see people jumping out of vehicles, could see doors opening, could see vehicles turning off into the sand, as well as those that we hit with our bombs.
F-15s, B-52s, Harriers, A-6s, and A-10s, every plane available bombed the highway for 2 days straight.
When the pilots came on scene, there were literally thousands upon thousands of vehicles stalled, empty, jammed in this giant. And they turned it into a trash heap.
Pilots called the 3-mile-long stretch of charred bodies and vehicles the highway of death. Initial reports were of tremendous carnage, thousands dead.
And it is 3 miles of the most amazing vehicular carnage you can imagine.
The Iraqi army didn't make a retreat at all. It was a headlong, panicky flight into disaster.
I don't know what the casualty count was there. We never got one, but I would say virtually every Iraq that was in that convoy was killed.
Newspapers called it a turkey shoot. Some even wondered if it was a violation of the Geneva Convention, which forbids killing an enemy clearly trying to surrender.
This was an armed retreat, and when we were bombing, we were receiving constant fire. All types of anti-aircraft artillery, machine guns, and missiles were being shot at us the entire time. This was an armed retreat, not a turkey shoot.
There's no doubt about it. There's a lot of destruction and death. But that's war, and that's what people have to understand.
After the war, Allies counted 1,500 destroyed vehicles on that highway. Only 2% had been armored personnel carriers or tanks. The rest were Kuwaiti cars full of loot. As for the death toll, later estimates showed it to be in the low hundreds, not thousands. At the time, however, it looked like an atrocity.
And there began to develop within the White House a concern about the public relations aspect of this victory. And after there were reports of a so-called highway of death, General Powell and President Bush became concerned that the American military not be seen as unnecessarily brutal, as, quote, shooting fleeing Iraqis in the back. They wanted to avoid this perception.
So the president and the general began to consider a ceasefire. The sands of Desert Storm were shifting. Political concerns were overriding military goals. By the 4th day of the ground war, Kuwait City had been liberated, and some 70,000 Iraqis had already surrendered. All of the Talwalkana Division and most of the Medina Division of the Republican Guard had been destroyed. Now, both regular Iraqi army and the Republican Guard were in retreat. President Bush was concerned that more fighting would lead to accusations of slaughtering Iraqis who were simply trying to escape.
It was clear that Iraqi forces were running out of Kuwait as fast as they could run. You basically have this image that the Iraqis are running and we're slaughtering.
Bush was particularly worried about the public reaction to the carnage on the so-called Highway of Death. Newspaper reports had described the relentless air attack there as shooting fish in a barrel.
Everyone, of course, was aware of those media images, and so everyone knew what Bush was talking about when he said, "We don't want to be subject to charges of brutalization."
On February 27th, 83 hours into the ground war, General Powell called General Schwarzkopf to let him know the White House wanted a ceasefire as soon as possible.
He told General Schwarzkopf, Norm, we're sitting here in the Oval Office having a conversation. The general sentiment is that it's about time to end it. Do you have a problem with that? That doesn't exactly invite dissent from General Schwarzkopf.
I got a query from General Schwarzkopf about, John, how much more time do you need to wrap this up? I asked for 24 more hours, which would have, instead of shutting the war off at daylight the following day, given us another day's worth of daylight to, as I call it, tidy up the battlefield.
While the president pondered his options for a ceasefire, General Schwarzkopf called what was to be the most controversial press conference of the war. In a bravura performance that later came to be known as the mother of all briefings, Schwarzkopf all but declared victory 1 day early.
We have rendered completely ineffective over 29 Iraqi divisions, and the gates are closed. There is no way out of here. There is no way out of here, and the enemy is fighting us in this location right here.
You said the gate was closed. Have you got ground forces blocking the roads to Basra?
No.
So is there any way that they can get out that way?
No. That's why the gate's closed.
The Iraqis were not surrounded. The gates were not closed. There was no substantial means at hand for the American military to block passage into Basra, second largest city in Iraq. And certainly there was no means to block passage out of Basra into the rest of Iraq.
He thought that more damage was being done to the Iraqis than in fact was being done. And he thought that air power had shut off the 2 Iraqi escape routes. Wasn't true. The Air Force had not closed Basra. They had not destroyed the causeway. And it wasn't through any lack of trying. But air power can only do so much. But if you're going to close a gate, if you're going to block a force, you need boots on the ground. And he didn't have it.
We continue, of course, to have overwhelming air power. The air has done a terrific job from start to finish.
So he misled people when he said the gate was closed. Most of all, he misled himself, and he certainly misled the administration.
This misapprehension was something that I think came back to haunt the American military to some extent, because it bespoke the fog of war in spades.
However, based partly on Schwarzkopf's briefing and partly on the symmetry of ending the conflict at 100 hours into the ground war, the administration decided to call a ceasefire. Military leaders at Central Command in Riyadh knew that wasn't enough time to finish off the Republican Guard.
Well, I said, I think that's a mistake. And Noam Schwarzkopf said to me, okay, you go get on the telephone and argue with them. I'm not going to argue anymore. I said, I'm not going to argue either. So we then sat down and started figuring out what all of this meant and how we were going to issue orders to stop the combat operation.
The fact that there was going to be a ceasefire came as an enormous surprise to the field commanders. And they were outraged by it, in addition to being surprised, because they felt that they had not completed their mission.
The destruction of the Republican Guard was one of the paramount military objectives of the war. It was put in writing in classified directives, and that's what General Powell had in mind when he gave his famous Pentagon press conference and said,
Our strategy to go after this army is very, very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it.
This was not a subsidiary goal, it was not a minor goal, it was a central goal. And yet half of the Republican Guard managed to escape.
I'm certainly not questioning the political decisions to stop the offensive operations, but General Schwarzkopf had given us the mission to destroy these divisions, and we knew we had not destroyed the Hammurabi at this point.
The Hammurabi was the best equipped of all the armored divisions of the Republican Guard. 3 Republican Guard infantry divisions also remained intact. At the time of the ceasefire, 18 Corps to the north of 7 Corps now had those 4 divisions nearly but not quite trapped along the northern border of the theater of war.
I think there was an element of disappointment because we were about to launch the final attack and close the last open gap of ground, and we were completely confident we'd do this successfully and rapidly.
The 24th Infantry Division, commanded by Barry McCaffrey, had been less than an hour away from blocking one of the 2 main escape routes into Iraq.
I think if the war had gone on for one more day, we would have sealed off the encircled force and taken away another 1,000 armored vehicles from them.
But the die had been cast. The ground war was halted after 100 hours.
I am pleased to announce that at midnight tonight, Eastern Standard Time, exactly 100 hours since ground operations commenced and 6 weeks since the start of Operation Desert Storm, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations.
2 days after the ceasefire, one patrol in General McCaffrey's 24th Infantry Division came upon the Hammurabi Division as it headed north.
A huge enemy force, well armed, blundered into our positions and fired, and we took decisive action, and thankfully no U.S. soldiers were killed.
General McCaffrey ordered that battalion and then the entire brigade and fundamentally the entire division to retaliate. The counterattack, which was entirely disproportionate to whatever offense the Iraqis may have given in the first place, lasted for hours.
It was one of the most devastating and controversial battles of the war. In May 2000, an expose in New Yorker magazine alleged that McCaffrey had launched an unprovoked attack on Iraqis who were complying with the ceasefire. McCaffrey claimed it was self-defense.
It was clear to me, as a division commander, that my forces were at risk.
We got permission to return fire, we returned fire, and we went out and captured those guys that fired at us. And while we were out there, the armored vehicle started firing on us.
Look, in the middle of the night, a battalion commander fell under attack. It is crazy for anyone to argue with the front line reporting of our captains in battle.
The rough rule of thumb was, if the guy was staying on the vehicle, we engaged the vehicle. And the ones out in the marsh that were waving, we just waved them to our rear. It was absolute pandemonium. There was no command and control. There was nothing but raw, blind panic.
A 2,100-page report by the Army's Criminal Investigations Division concluded the engagement was clearly provoked by the Iraqis. Although some questioned McCaffrey's judgment in using such overwhelming force, no one denied the extent of the destruction. The Iraqis lost 30 tanks and 346 armored vehicles in the battle. Even that, however, did not incapacitate the Republican Guard. A shocking number had managed to escape. Ending the war before the Army could cut off all the escape routes into Iraq allowed the better part of the Republican Guard to get away with nearly half their armor. Even President Bush acknowledged the victory with mixed feelings.
You know, to be very honest with you, I haven't yet felt this wonderfully euphoric feeling that many of the American people feel. But I think it's that I want to see an end. You mentioned World War II. There was a definitive end to that conflict. And now we have Saddam Hussein still there.
In the end, the decision to make the war was made on political grounds more than military grounds. And I know from talking to people in the Bush administration that there really, at least among many of the civilians, was not an appreciation that half the Republican Guard was going to get away.
According to General Powell, the White House knew some units of the Republican Guard might slip through its grasp after the ceasefire. This CIA document shows just how many did escape: 70% of the Republican Guard and half of their armor. The decision to allow them to go is still being debated today.
Why would you leave roughly 40% of the Republican Guard tanks and heavy vehicles when all you had to do was to put a satchel charge in them or let a helicopter or an airplane put a bomb on top of it? And we have suffered from that and paid the price for that since the war ended.
In fact, there were some who argued at the time U.S. forces should have turned toward Baghdad to force Saddam to flee.
Ladies and gentlemen, when we were here, we were 150 miles away from Baghdad, and there was nobody between us and Baghdad. If it had been our intention to overrun the country, we could have done it unopposed.
Saddam would have fled. We were sure because we were in touch with the people inside, especially with the army generals in Baghdad.
Wafiq Samarai was Iraq's military intelligence chief during the Gulf War and was with Saddam Hussein when the ceasefire was announced.
He changed from a man sensing danger, sensing death was coming to him at any minute, to a man who escaped drowning and got away unscathed.
The Bush administration said that the main reason the U.S. didn't go after Saddam at that point was because the coalition would not have supported such a move.
As long as we were leading the coalition liberating Kuwait, we were looked upon, I think, with great favor and widespread support in the Arab world. If we'd crossed over to the point where we were going to Baghdad, taking down an Arab government and replacing it with some other kind of government, then we would have been the colonial imperialist power and the perception would have been very different.
However, no sooner had the Gulf War ended when another battle began inside Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Ordinary citizens, mostly from the Muslim Shiite sect in the south, took up arms against his repressive regime, a move encouraged by President Bush during the war.
But there's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands, to force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside.
So when some Iraqis revolted after the war, the White House believed Saddam's days were numbered. That is one reason General Schwarzkopf was left on his own, with no instructions to wrap up the ceasefire talks. They would take place at an airfield occupied by the coalition in Safwan, Iraq.
I will tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that when Norm Schwarzkopf went to meet with those generals from the other side, he had very little direction from anybody, whether it was from the president's advisors or whether it was from the State Department, as to what he was supposed to say or do.
The coalition led by Schwarzkopf was only looking for the return of POWs and a clear line of demarcation between the two forces to prevent further battles. They didn't consider asking the Iraqis to surrender equipment. The coalition's objective was to extract themselves from the war as quickly as possible.
The American military was in such a hurry to withdraw from the region, I think it lost sight of the strategic consequences.
The Iraqis agreed to all conditions and then asked for one thing: permission to fly their helicopters.
Schwarzkopf was being magnanimous, and he said, yes, that would be okay. And the Iraqis were rather taken aback by this. They think they were surprised that the Americans were giving them this concession. And they said, you mean even helicopters that are armed in the sky can fly? And Schwarzkopf said essentially, sure, just don't keep them anywhere near us.
However, Schwarzkopf's decision had in effect armed Saddam Hussein so that he could put down the Shiite rebellion and rally his troops.
We made a classic American mistake, and that is usually, generally, normally, Americans will always try to be fair. We were trying to be fair to a country that we had just defeated overwhelmingly. We had no idea that they were going to use those armed helicopters in the manner that we did.
The decision to permit the helicopters to fly was a mistake. Everybody says, well, that's 20/20 hindsight. Permitting the helicopters to fly is not 20/20 hindsight to an airman. Had I been sitting at Safwan, I would have never agreed to that.
American troops stood by while tens of thousands of Shiites were massacred. The same fate was met by Iraqi Kurds in the north, who organized their own uprising against Saddam. But before the Kurds were completely decimated, the coalition forces created a safe haven for them.
We feel very bad because our relatives, our friends, our families are suffering, and the one reason for their suffering now is because the Americans, did not finish the job in 1991.
For the United States, the quick, clean exit from Iraq was anything but final. It created a decade of political and even military unrest.
In fact, one of the 3 Republican Guard divisions earmarked for destruction in the Gulf War, the Hammurabi Division, later came back in the fall of '94 to menace Kuwait, one of the very same divisions that was earmarked for destruction.
After the Gulf War ended, President Clinton attacked Iraq twice, in 1993 and 1998. In 2001, President George W. Bush's first military action, 1 month into office, was an airstrike near Baghdad. U.S. planes continue to patrol no-fly zones in northern and southern Iraq and regularly bomb radar installations and anti-aircraft sites. Most troubling, Saddam Hussein has refused to comply with the post-war United Nations attempts to find and destroy his weapons of mass destruction. Like the war, it was a mission that ended before it was completed. According to UN weapons inspectors, at least 8 tons of anthrax, among other chemical and biological weapons, were left behind. Iraq may not have been the quagmire that Vietnam was, but the Gulf War never really ended either.
The irony is, in the rush for the exit, in their desire to avoid a quagmire, in their haste to get out of the region, the American military brought about the very situation that it feared. It brought about a situation where there is an open-ended quality to the conflict in the Gulf.
When we come back, lessons learned
on the History Channel.
At the time, there was no doubt that Operation Desert Storm was a decisive victory.
I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
Kuwaitis celebrated in the street. The main objective of the war, to eject Iraq from Kuwait, was accomplished.
Not everything in the Gulf War was successful or well thought out, but those things that seemed to have worked were direct lessons from Vietnam.
For example, where goals in Vietnam were muddy, the goals in the Persian Gulf were very clear.
The president himself said, I want Iraq out of Kuwait. I want minimum loss of life. I want him not be able to reconstitute and threaten his neighbors in the near future, and I want it over with quickly.
In contrast to Vietnam, where the use of force was minimal, in the Gulf, the U.S. used overwhelming, decisive force to achieve victory. That became known as the Powell Doctrine.
The Powell Doctrine of decisive force clearly worked, and it worked because we were not pressured into doing things prematurely before we had the wherewithal to do it with an absolute high degree of assurance of success.
To create that overwhelming force, the military used all its available resources in a coordinated effort.
Number 5, 1 round.
It was the first time the U.S. employed a unified command structure which had been the centerpiece of Soviet war-fighting capability.
Joint forces, joint air, naval, ground forces, synchronized and coordinated and focused appropriately is the right way to fight. And we had worked on the joint aspects of warfare for a number of years prior to the Gulf War, and it paid off in spades during that conflict.
In addition, air power showed its great potential during the Gulf War.
6 weeks of air operation yielded a 4-day ground campaign that was completed at exchange rates never heard of in the history of warfare. And analysts from the Army have looked at that afterwards, and they directly attribute our success on the ground, for example, with the residual effects of air attacks.
The Air Force, in my view, did a magnificent job for us. Number one, there weren't any Iraqi airplanes flying against me. So the greatest service the United States Air Force did in the Gulf War is they took away the Iraqi enemy Air Force. Secondly, politically, they were bombing deep to take away his ability to communicate, his ability to direct operations through those communications, and they did a superb job of that.
Following the model in the Gulf, air power dominated later conflicts in the Balkans as well as in Afghanistan.
Air power has become the preeminent military force in the battlefield. And while it may not solve every problem, and it may not even be applicable in some situations, it's going to probably be the first choice of U.S. in terms of fighting wars.
What air power could not make up for was the lack of good military intelligence.
The lack of intelligence itself was singularly the most inhibiting thing in the Gulf War. Either inaccurate intelligence or the total lack of intelligence.
Of 60-plus targets that were on the target list of chemical and biological related facilities, only 3 of them had actual chemical and biological weapons stored at them during the war.
As it turned out, after the war, there were 39 nuclear sites, nuclear weapons development sites in Iraq that we never saw, and a total of 239 of chemical and biological targets that we didn't know about. So our intelligence on one of the key aspects of the war, chemical, biological, and nuclear capabilities of the Iraqis, was sadly deficient.
Intelligence gathering continues to be a challenge in the war against terrorism. Nevertheless, Operation Desert Storm was an astonishing success in one respect. The war was won with only 146 Americans killed in action, so few that many called it the bloodless war. But it also created a set of expectations that may never be met again.
Unfortunately, the principal lessons we took away from the Gulf War was the fact that we could fight and win very quickly with virtually nobody getting hurt. That lesson is one that has carried over in a very, very negative fashion.
The American military is afraid that if they have casualties, the Congress will complain, the people will complain, they'll be criticized as a failure. And really what you need to do is explain to people, hey, war is a dirty business, it's often very cruel, people get hurt, but it's something that's occasionally is necessary to defend your important and vital interests.
2, 1, launch.
Operation Desert Storm was distinguished by the meticulous military planning that took place before the actual invasion. The same could not be said of the ceasefire and beyond.
This is sort of a Cold War in the Persian Gulf region. Yes, we won our victory, but now we're committed to a containment strategy.
The untidy end of the conflict showed that it is not enough to plan a war. There must also be a plan for the peace that follows.
As it turned out, the final showdown of the Gulf War was just a prologue. When the fog of war lifted, it was obvious that the situation in the Persian Gulf was not resolved. Over the years, Saddam has proven a master at clinging to power and defying the world's attempts to dismantle his military machine. His future, though, may finally be decided soon. The History Channel will continue with our perspective on current events. I'm Arthur Kent. Stay with us because history matters.